Hey y'all! It's entry number 57 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Tyreek Hill, wide receiver, Miami Dolphins. We'll start with the positives with Tyreek Hill's fantasy profile, year-to-year consistency, and fantasy finishes throughout his career. Tyreek Hill has had 75 or more catches, 1,180 or more receiving yards, and 7 or more receiving touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 seasons in the NFL. In .5 PPR formats, his career fantasy finishes are as follows. WR22 in 2016. With 168.5 total fantasy points and 10.5 fantasy points per game. The WR8 in 2017 with 201.7 total fantasy points and 13.4 fantasy points per game. The WR1 in 2018 with 284.5 total fantasy points and 17.8 fantasy points per game. The WR30 in 2019 with 159.3 total fantasy points and 13.3 fantasy points per game. The WR2 in 2020 with 285.4 total fantasy points and 19.0 fantasy points per game, and the WR6 in 2021 with 241.0 total fantasy points and 14.2 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. He's been a locked and loaded wide receiver 1 in nearly every season of his career, and the only seasons he technically wasn't were his rookie year, where he still finished as a WR2 and had a strong finish to the year, and the 2019 season where he missed 4 games and was 10th in fantasy points per game that year. The next thing I really like about Tyreek Hill's fantasy profile is his air yards and expected fantasy points. According to RotoWire, Tyreek Hill had 99.8 air yards per game, 2.07 air yards per snap, and 37.3% of his team's air yards in 2021. All of which were above average according to RotoWire. In addition, he had 885 unrealized air yards, the 7th most among NFL wide receivers in 2021 according to Player Profiler. He also averaged the 9th most fantasy points per route run with 0.55 and the 2nd most expected fantasy points per game with 20.2 among wide receivers according to Player Profiler in 2021. These numbers suggest that there may have been a little meat left on the bone last year for Hill, and he could be in for some positive regression. The last thing I really like about Tyreek Hill's fantasy profile is that he's already proven that he can be an elite fantasy wide receiver without Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes is one of the best quarterbacks in the league, so some people may argue that Hill has only been a fantasy WR1 because of Mahomes. But that's simply not true. In the 2017 season, with Alex Smith as the Kansas City Chiefs' starting quarterback, Hill had 75 receptions on 105 targets for 1,183 receiving yards and 7 receiving touchdowns, good for a WR8 finish in half PPR formats. So yes, while Hill will experience a QB downgrade from Patrick Mahomes to Tua Tagovailoa, this doesn't necessarily mean that we should completely shut down the notion of him being a solid WR1 in 2022. Moving on to some of the concerns with Tyreek Hill's fantasy profile. 2021 week-to-week inconsistency. Tyreek Hill is known for being a speedster and a big play receiver that can put up monster fantasy weeks at any given time. But because of how much of a threat he is on the field, defenses may also make a point to put extra coverage on Hill, and that can result in him having some subpar individual fantasy weeks. During the 2021 NFL season, in half PPR formats, Hill had 4 out of 17 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 5 out of 17 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 2 out of 17 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 3 out of 17 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. So in over half of his starts last year, Hill scored under 10 points, and in almost a quarter of them, he scored under 5 points. The next major concern I have with Tyreek Hill's fantasy profile is how many fantasy-relevant pass catchers can Tua Tagovailoa support? Tyreek Hill will no longer have Patrick Mahomes, one of the best quarterbacks in the league, throwing him the ball with the move from Kansas City to Miami, and instead will have the more unproven Tua Tagovailoa throwing him the ball. Tua has operated as more of a game manager early in his NFL career. Over the course of his 23-game NFL career, Tua has averaged 19.5 completions on 29.5 passing attempts for 194.2 passing yards and 1.17 passing touchdowns per game, according to Pro Football Reference. He has just 3 games in his career thus far where he's thrown for over 300 passing yards, and just 1 game in his career thus far where he's thrown more than 2 touchdowns. Week 7 against the Atlanta Falcons in 2021, according to Pro Football Reference. He hasn't proven that he can support more than 1 fantasy wide receiver yet, so it will be interesting to see how it plays out in 2022 when he has 2 very talented wide receivers to throw to in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddell. The last concern I have with Tyreek Hill's fantasy profile is the projected worse offense. I do have high hopes for the new offense in Miami, with all the new weapons and new head coach Mike McDaniel calling the plays. But it's important to remember that this still is most likely a downgrade for Hill. Last year, the Miami Dolphins averaged just 307 total yards per game, the 25th best mark in the NFL, and 20.1 points per game, the 22nd best mark in the NFL according to ESPN. For reference, the Chiefs' offense ranked 3rd in yards per game with 396.8 and 4th in points per game with 28.2 according to ESPN in 2021. Playing in a worse offense likely means fewer scoring opportunities for Hill in 2022. Some additional thoughts on Tyreek Hill's fantasy profile. In 2021, Tyreek Hill finished as the WR7 in Standard with 185.5 total fantasy points and 10.9 fantasy points per game. The WR6.5 PPR formats with 241.0 total fantasy points and 14.2 fantasy points per game, and the WR6 in full PPR formats with 296.5 total fantasy points and 17.4 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2021 season, Hill had the 7th most targets per route run among wide receivers with 28.0%, according to fantasy data. In 2020, Tyreek Hill scored at least 1 receiving touchdown in 11 out of 15 games. In 2020, Tyreek Hill only had 3 games with more than 100 receiving yards in weeks 9, 11, and 12. Personal opinion. Tyreek Hill is currently going off the board as WR7, about pick 17 overall on ESPN, and WR9, about pick 25 overall on Yahoo. His ADP seems pretty much on the money on Yahoo relative to the value. I also have him in more of the WR9, WR10 range. But on ESPN, I think he's a little overvalued as he's currently going ahead of some other great players who are in more static situations like DeAndre Swift and Travis Kelce. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Tyreek Hill's My Cause, My Cleats in 2020 was for the Tyreek Hill Foundation. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.